This is the first time that we've come together across the hemisphere to take shared responsibility for the migration challenge.
Y no voy a la cumbre porque no se invita a todos los países de América, que es seguir con la vieja política de intervencionismo, de falta de respeto a las naciones y a sus pueblos.
Boycotts and a public outcry over the Biden administration's decision to exclude Cuba, Venezuela and Nicaragua from the Summit of the Americas amid growing signs of the United States' waning clout. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Ghida Fakhry. The Summit of the Americas was hosted by the United States in Los Angeles last week for the first time in almost 2 decades. The last time the US hosted the event was in Miami in 1994 during the Clinton administration. Now, despite a final agreement on migration signed by 20 governments, the summit was marred by boycotts and divisions following the Biden administration's decision not to invite what it described as, quote, undemocratic governments.
Yes, we have these couple of countries who are not going to be attending, but the president has to stick by his principle. He believes that he needs to stick by his principles and not invite dictators.
The U.S. decision to exclude Cuba, Nicaragua and Venezuela from the summit was condemned by the presidents of Mexico, Honduras, Bolivia and Guatemala, who all boycotted the summit. The president of El Salvador, whose leadership has been criticized by the Biden administration, also decided not to attend. In all, the leaders of 8 countries did not participate. Others expressed harsh criticism of the U.S. decision to keep out 3 of the 35 members of the Organization of American States, including Cuba, the largest island nation in the Caribbean.
It's wrong that Cuba and Venezuela, Nicaragua are not here because, as you heard from Bahamas, that we need to speak with those with whom we disagree, and we don't only need to narrow cast.
The newly elected president of Chile, Gabriel Boric, expressed similar concerns.
Acá debiéramos estar todos y no estamos todos. Porque no me gusta la exclusión de Cuba, Venezuela y Nicaragua. ¿Y saben por qué? Porque sería distinto sostener en un foro como este, con todos los países presentes, incluso aquellos que decidieron restarse por esta exclusión, la urgente necesidad de la liberación de los presos políticos de Nicaragua, o también la importancia moral y práctica de terminar de una vez por todas con el injusto e inaceptable bloqueo de Estados Unidos al pueblo de Cuba.
This was a far cry from the 7th Summit of the Americas held in Panama City in 2015, when President Barack Obama met with Cuba's President Raúl Castro following his administration's decision to restore full diplomatic relations with Havana earlier that year. President Obama removed Cuba from the U.S. list of state sponsors of terrorism, vowing to, quote, cut loose the shackles of the past. The Trump administration imposed new sanctions on Cuba in 2019 and relisted Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism, decisions that were not rescinded by President Biden despite his campaign pledge to reverse the, quote, failed Trump policies. While the Biden administration recently eased some restrictions, Trump-era U.S. sanctions against Cuba and a 6-year-old trade embargo remain in place. Earl Anthony Wayne is the former Assistant Secretary of State for Economic and Business Affairs. He served as ambassador to Argentina and Mexico under the Obama administration. He joins me now. Ambassador Wayne, there was so much hope and anticipation before the summit that President Biden would usher in a new era in U.S. relations with Latin America, that he would break with Trump's policies and return to Obama's diplomatic engagement and re-engagement with countries like Cuba. What happened?
Well, I think a couple of things have happened. One is that Biden does want to re-engage with the countries of the Americas, but he's also stressing the importance of democracy. And this is something he put forward while he was still a candidate and has remained focused on. And that makes it very hard for him to be open to re-engaging at this time with Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, who have in fact increased their repressive activities over the last year.
But is this really about democracy? Because many people would point out that the US administration under President Biden continues to cozy up to dictators with checkered past and checkered democratic and human rights records when it serves the United States' interests. How much of this is driven by domestic politics?
Well, certainly domestic politics play a role in this, and there is strong opposition in the United States to those three dictatorships in the countries. But I think really what Biden was hoping to do was to re-engage with those countries that are interested in re-engaging on themes that are important across the Americas, the economy, recovering from COVID, and in his view, strengthening democracy, which is under threat.
But again, is it about Biden keeping his eye on the midterm elections later this year, on a possible run in 2024? The president of Mexico blamed it all on pressure from Republicans and Democrats in the US Congress, as well as the influence of the Cuban-American lobby. He also said, we need, quote, to change the policy of exclusion. It cannot be the summit of the Americas if all countries cannot participate. Was it a mistake for the administration to have excluded Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela?
I think that would have created a controversy on the other side also if they had been involved. I think what President Biden was trying to do does reflect the attitudes of politics in the United States, but it also is trying to focus on a new agenda about dealing with the real lives of many in Latin America. They suffered terribly under the pandemic, a terrible recession, the worst recession for a region in the world. And there are many, many thousands of migrants, millions of migrants who've left countries like Venezuela, countries in Central America and other places that are in dire need of better cooperation across the Americas to meet those needs.
But precisely, how do you achieve that if you leave out certain countries, or if you allow certain countries to take a stand to boycott the summit when you need their cooperation to deal with these issues?
Well, I think if you look at who actually came, those countries where the leaders decided not to come sent their ministers, and they actually actively participated in all of the discussions.
Well, it isn't the same, though, Ambassador, to send a minister or for the head of state to be there. The leaders of Mexico and Guatemala, two of the key countries as far as migration is concerned for the United States, were not there.
I agree. And that was a mistake on their part, not to be there to try to build a consensus. If they had a difference of opinion, they could have been there to work on building a consensus. President of Mexico announced at the same time that he wasn't going to Los Angeles, that he was going to Washington at the beginning of July. And his foreign minister was there and actively participated in negotiating the documents coming out of that agreement. So there was a lot of grandstanding also. I think you know that politicians from every country grandstand and play to their own domestic audiences. And
Isn't that exactly what the
case,
United States is doing? Playing to its own domestic audience.
Everybody does that to a certain degree.
How do you reconcile not inviting certain countries because, quote, we don't believe dictators should be invited, which is what the administration said, while President Biden is simultaneously planning a trip to Saudi Arabia, which he himself vowed to make a pariah not too long ago?
Well, I think that it did create a distraction that they weren't invited. I think given President Biden's emphasis in many of his other international meetings on strengthening democracy, it makes sense. it doesn't mean that the United States is not going to engage with these countries, just as it is engaging with other populist countries and dictatorships and autocracies around the world. But if you're going to be hosting them in the United States, I think that it is a defendable decision, and it's a distraction. This argument about inclusiveness, I don't think really is very strong.
You call it a distraction, though.
Inclusiveness.
Forgive me for interrupting you. You call it a distraction. Do you also see it as an embarrassment, which is what many people watching it have said it was? It's all happening at a critical time for the United States when the US is trying to counter China's growing clout. And what is happening is that we saw that the US's influence is actually dwindling, and the influence of countries like China is on the ascendance.
Well, this is a very good point, and that's why let's step back a minute and see what's happening. Over the past decade in the Americas, China has started buying many more products, often raw materials, either food or minerals or other things from the Americas, and so that's important to them. Also, democracy has declined in the Americas over this last decade. And also the United States has paid less attention to the Americas in recent years.
Earl Anthony Wayne, former US Secretary of State, thank you so much for being with me.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Now, on the final day of the Summit of the Americas, 20 governments signed on to the Los Angeles Declaration of Migration and Protection, which President Biden touted as proof of unity among those who attended the summit.
With this declaration, we're transforming our approach to managing migration in the Americas. And in addition to securing our border and bringing order to the asylum processing in the United States, the Department of Homeland Security is leading the first of its kind campaign to disrupt human smuggling in the region.
But will the Los Angeles Agreement go the way of the Free Trade Area of the Americas, an initiative announced to much fanfare in 1994? The last time the US hosted the summit. That agreement, intended to be an extension of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, quietly died a decade later as countries failed to meet self-imposed deadlines for implementing the free trade zone. NAFTA significantly increased trade between the US and Mexico, although China has become a major trading partner for other Latin and South American countries. While US trade with Mexico exceeds its trade with all other Latin American countries combined, Chinese trade with Latin America has increased considerably in the last 5 years, hitting nearly $500 billion last year and exceeding US trade with all Latin American countries with the exception of Mexico. China has implemented free trade agreements with some countries in the region and is in the process of negotiating more. Jorge Heine was Chile's ambassador to China from 2014 to 2017. He previously served as Minister of National Assets in the Chilean government. He is a research professor at the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University. Ambassador Heine, the Chilean government said the exclusion of certain countries was a sign of disrespect for the region, that issues should be discussed democratically among all countries. US officials, on the other hand, say that their decisions, their policies are based on countries' lack of respect for democracy. Is this why President Biden has adopted what you've called a Trump-light approach, or is there more to it?
Yes. Well, the proof is in the pudding. My sense is that the key indicator we should look at is the number of leaders that actually showed up in Los Angeles. That number was 23. There are 35 countries in the Americas. 34 showed up in Panama for the 2015 summit. So one way of measuring the success of diplomatic summits, I participated in a number of them, is by the number of leaders who actually showed up. If we look at that indicator, the Los Angeles summit obviously does not measure up.
And so looking at that indicator, how would you describe the US's standing in the region today?
Well, it doesn't look well. If Panama was able to draw 34 leaders, Panama is not exactly one of the biggest countries in the world, and the United States is only able to draw 23. I would say there is a problem. Now, The reason there is a problem, and there are several of them, is once you start excluding countries and you start from the word go by saying these three countries will not be invited, well, you create a certain amount of pushback. And one thing led to the other. And in the end, a dozen leaders did not attend.
So you just said there would be a lot of pushback from the region, and that's what we saw from many governments and their leaders. Many countries have now been turning increasingly towards China. You were Chile's ambassador to China just a few years ago. Today, China is South America's top trading partner and the second largest for Latin America as a whole, after the United States. In 2000, in fact, in the year 2000, the Chinese market accounted for less than 2% of Latin America's exports. Over the next 8 years, trade grew at an average annual rate of 31%, reaching a value of $180 billion in 2010. By 2021, trade totaled $450 billion, and economists are now predicting that it could exceed $700 billion by 2035. Are you surprised?
No, I'm not surprised at all. I mean, the biggest story in the world today, in many ways, is, that of Chinese growth. So what is happening between Latin America and China should not surprise anybody. In fact, this is particularly true for South America, even more so than for Latin America as a whole. Why is this so? Because South America is particularly rich in commodities, in natural resources, both in minerals, things like copper, oil, iron ore, and also in agricultural products. China demands minerals, demands natural resources. And a very interesting figure that not a lot of people know. China's population is about 19% of the world's population, but it only has 7% of the world's freshwater resources and 7% of the world's arable land. This means that China will always have to import large amounts of food. And South America's equation in that regard is very different. It has a lot of land, it is underpopulated, and can export a lot of food. So in some ways, it's a marriage made in heaven, as they say.
When you look at the shifting geopolitics of the region, when you look at the new wave of leftist progressive leaders, whether it's in Chile or in Peru or in Bolivia, or possibly in Colombia later this month with a second round election that will take place, and possibly as well in Brazil in the fall with a potential rise of Lula yet again as president there. What do you make of this new ascendance for the left, and what does it mean for Washington?
Sure. I think that is a very good question. Situation is the following. We have had, in the past few years, a very bad run in Latin America. Latin America has been hit by both the pandemic. Latin America has been, for all intents and purposes, ground zero of the pandemic. 1.7 million people have died as a result of it. One of the highest shares per population in the world. And also it has been hit by a severe economic slowdown. There are a number of reasons for this, but at least some of them have to do with the bad way in which Latin American governments have handled this. As a result, there has been a strong reaction among the citizens, and they voted in new governments. They voted in the opposition in many countries. And as a result, we have that many of the conservative governments that have been in place are being replaced by progressive governments.
All right, an interesting time certainly in the region with a lot of shifting sands. Jorge Heine, a former cabinet minister in the Chilean government, currently professor at Boston University. Thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Now, in parallel to the Summit of the Americas organized by the Biden administration, a coalition of over 100 grassroots organizations from the region gathered in Los Angeles last week to host the People's Summit for Democracy, with progressives winning key elections from Peru to Honduras and Chile, activists point to the changing regional dynamics and the wave of new left-wing political leaders reshaping Latin America. In Colombia, leftist presidential candidate Gustavo Petro leads in the polls ahead of the second round of voting on June 19th. With the political left on the ascendance across the region, many of those protesting against the Summit of the Americas say the Biden administration has underestimated the will of a majority of countries and their peoples to counter the U.S.'s traditional dominance of the Western Hemisphere. One of those activists is Sheila Xiao. She was the co-coordinator of the People's Summit for Democracy and is the co-founder of Pivot for Peace, an organization that represents Americans opposed to the drive toward confrontation between the United States and China. Sheila Xiao, President Biden promised that this would be the most diverse summit ever. Instead, it became known as the Summit of Exclusion. We saw just how many countries decided to close ranks with those who were left off the guest list, despite their strong historical ties with the United States and economic ties as well. What would the long-term impact of all of this have on the region going forward?
The summit of the excluded, as we call it, informally and formally, has really shown the decline in U.S. hegemony across the region. All you have to do is look at the last couple decades to see the type of havoc the U.S. government has waged on the continent. I think this is really, really crucial. And it's not for nothing that the People's Summit, the summit that we held, really was an expression of, we're not going to take it anymore. We're not going to stand here and let the U.S. dictate which countries get to be included in the Americas and which countries don't. And so I think the long-term impact is that the U.S. government really embarrassed itself. I mean, Biden thought that he could come into Los Angeles and ignore the great levels of inequality, poverty, homelessness, and use LA as a platform to say, I get to dictate the policies across the continent. And we rose up.
You recently wrote a piece in which you said, quote, "For the Americas, which are on the cusp of transformative times, the age of the Monroe Doctrine is over." Will we see less reliance from governments on Washington moving forward, more cooperation among countries of Latin America, and more willingness to stand up to the United States?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I haven't been in the movement nearly as long as many of the others who have fought for, solidarity with Cuba and Venezuela. I've been in the movement here in Los Angeles for 8 years. But what I can tell you is within that 8 years, I can see that the tiny group of people who dared to stand up against the US empire has grown, has expanded to the point where hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people flooded into the streets to say, end the blockade on Cuba, end these deadly sanctions on Venezuela, right? Stop overthrowing governments. So I have so much hope.
All right, Sheila Xiao, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
For almost 2 decades, the Summit of the Americas has been a useful tool to measure the fluctuating influence and clout of the United States across the Western Hemisphere. From its first summit in 1994, when the U.S. was unrivaled on the regional and international stage following the collapse of the Soviet Union, to its summit last week, where President Biden faced a rebellious mood, the summit offered a glaring glimpse into how far the United States' standing and prestige had fallen. Those who stayed away defiantly in protest against Biden's exclusionary summit, including Mexico, the U.S.'s top trading partner, which is also the second largest country in Latin America in terms of population and the second largest economy in the region, condemned what it called U.S. hegemony and the old policy of interventionism and lack of respect. Those who attended did so with an equally strong warning to Washington. The region, with its new wave of leftist progressive leaders from Chile to Honduras, Bolivia and Peru, and perhaps soon Colombia, the U.S.'s once steadfast regional ally, sent their powerful neighbor an unmistakable message that the age of the Monroe Doctrine, which had kept the Western Hemisphere since 1823 at the mercy of U.S. interventionism and under Washington's virtual control, is now over. The countries of the region, to the left and the right of the political spectrum, also sent Washington a clear message that the era of its hegemony had ended, that its diktats will be rejected. They know they have alternatives today that they didn't in 1994. The US is no longer the region's top trading partner. China-Latin America trade last year exceeded $400 billion compared to $295 billion for the US. And so, in short, the Summit of the Americas has offered a measure of how far Washington's influence over the countries south of its border is waning. It has also offered Washington a wake-up call. The reach of its hegemonic power, even among some of its closest allies, is shifting, while its policies remain stuck in the past. That's all from me, Ghida Fakhry, from the entire team in Washington. Thanks for watching.